electric vehicles are not sustainable. The myth is everybody thinks that because they bought their battery-powered car, that they are being sustainable. They're actually absolutely not, for two reasons. One, and this is based on Toyota's research, this is one of the reasons that Toyota has not gone into the electric route. They have gone into the hybrid route. This is called their 1-6-90 principle. The production of one fully electric car is equivalent to the production of 6 plug-in hybrid cars or 90 hybrid cars in terms of resources and carbon footprint over the life cycle of the car. So you can make one Tesla-like car or 90 hybrid cars. The impact is the same.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Ali is a great example of how urban planning can effectively drive sustainability and inclusion. Leading city planning at the Etihad Rail in Abu Dhabi, he's at the forefront of the National Railway Master Plan. With projects under his belt with the World Bank, MIT, and Harvard, Ali's innovative research and planning have earned him several awards. Ali's journey from war refugee to becoming an expert in urban planning is very inspiring, and his work for the government has played a big role in shaping his unique approach. He's not just focused on sustainable design, but also making sure these aspects bring economic value, effectively aligning all the priorities of the different stakeholders within the design process. For this episode, get ready to hear how he's turning sustainability into something economically viable. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome, Ali, to the Building Green podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ladina. It's good. I appreciate the invite.
You're an expert in urban planning and sustainability, Ali, and you lead the city planning at Etihad Rail in Abu Dhabi, where you spearhead the UAE National Railway Master Plan. You have worked on projects with the World Bank, MIT, and Harvard, and your innovative research and planning have earned you a few awards, including the British Petroleum Courage Award. You have a rich and diverse background in urban planning and sustainability. Can you share your journey with me? What were the crucial moments that shaped your career?
Thinking about this, it goes back a little bit to when I was a little kid. I remember I had a deep fascination with broken objects, and especially my grandfather's watches, who recently passed, may he rest in peace. I used to steal his watches and the broken ones and try to fix them up. And few times I succeeded. And the thrill of fixing something as a child is just really priceless. So that triggered another appetite, which is to break things a little bit, find things and break them so that I get that thrill again. So that's where it really started. 35 years ago. Fast forward to my early adulthood, around 10 years or so of age, and I was on a lifeboat fleeing the war. It's sort of the typical American story, right? You flee the war and you end up, long story short, you end up in America. But I did flee that war, and looking back at it, and I realized, okay, there are problems that are bigger than small watches, and these problems can manifest themselves in urban form. So that's where I paved my sort of trajectory into architecture. I became an architect for the better of 10 years. I moved to America, And in America, I looked back again, and that's where actually I had the privilege of thinking even bigger. How can I prevent things that have happened in Iraq, my home country, from happening again? So I started delving into sort of city planning. And what does that mean? And really, I had no idea that I was delving into sort of sustainable urban development or really sustainability altogether. So I started jumping around between architecture, urban design, planning, even budget allocations on a city level. And most recently on all mobility projects, and have come to learn that really there is no single identifier of what sustainability is. It's just a way of life. It's a way of how we can actually live modestly with the resources of a bountiful earth. That's a really sort of a high level definition to how it ended up for me. So right now, I'm in the sort of the thing that I found, from architecture, it was not enough to fix buildings. I remember I was working with the refugee camp, Zatari refugee camp, with the colleagues of mine in Perkins and Wilnet, and it was really amazing how architecture could bring people together. So that was a sustainability part for me. It's more on a social level there. Then it was not enough. So I had to scale up a little bit. So scaled up to the city's level. And now I'm thinking even what's next? Well, people move across all over Earth. So let's think about movement across the Earth. And that's really where I'm sort of settling at the moment.
Very cool story. And now, as the head of city planning at Etihad Rail, what does your day-to-day role look like?
It's pretty remarkable. It's very, very agile. We're challenged with new and exciting things every day. So not necessarily, city planning as a profession is a huge umbrella, right? It's not only urban form, but it's also the social fabric. It's also economics. It's also finances. So anything that impacts the human individual, you or I, is part of city planning. So you can imagine the different sort of the plethora of subjects we have to cover. Things that I probably have not been educated on in my academic career. And I do learn them on the job. So my day to day is dealing from things about, how people move into identifying sort of social science methods on how can we use data science to identify optimal solutions for locations of, transit nodes, for example. Or in the case of the work at Harvard of how can we use predictive modeling to identify how people will travel in the future. What will the level 5 AVs mean for modal shift? Will people still want to drive their cars if the cars drive themselves? So even that, delving into that level, building multivariate regression models, it's not really planning. It's more about data science. But it does, the outcome of it is very city planning focused. So my day to day is sometimes just dealing with conventional planning frameworks and looking at land use and looking at transport demand models and looking at business cases. Other days, it's looking at population distribution. It's looking at bankability of a project. It's looking at where are the issues that we're currently facing in terms of waste management. So it's very broad. It's very exciting, actually. Every day is a learning opportunity for me when the subject is city planning.
And before we go deeper into the whole design concept, you mentioned a few topics that sparked a big interest in me. But can you delve into like the ideas you've studied of traveling in the future?
So that's a project we have recently concluded with Martha Schwartz. So in 2021, just at the end of COVID, Martha Schwartz, who's a dear friend now and an ex-professor at Harvard, phoned me up one day and said, "Hey, look, I know. Actually, maybe I should go back 5 years before that. In 2017, I was working for the MIT Center of Advanced Urbanism, and one of our key projects was actually autonomous urbanism. Was about identifying the future of cities in an autonomous world." At that time, just to give you an idea, we're looking 2016, 2017, things like AI and ChatGPT was pretty much there in the MIT ecosystem, but the world had no idea what it was. So we were working with predictive modeling. We were working with language models, large learning models, we're working on all these things to predict on a spatial level, to predict the future of transformation of urban form. And based off of that, basically that is an output of how the street infrastructure transforms from level 5 AVs. So what we've done for a client, I think it was the Toyota Research Institute, was design an entire city, much like the woven city today. What does the autonomous future look like? And it was for a town. It's in Texas. It's called McKinney, and we looked at land use impacts of autonomous mobility. Autonomous mobility is coming in. How is it going to transform our cities? How is the streetscape going to change? How is the land use going to change? So that journey was basically the input to our conversation in 2021 when Martha called. And she said, hey, look, there is a climate change solutions fund. And I think we should do something on the impact of nature-based solutions. What can we do here? So we started brainstorming, and the outcome of that was like, hey, look, I spent a long time learning about the future of mobility and the impact on urban form. You're the expert on nature-based solutions. I think there is a little bit of an overlap here. Maybe we can explore that potential. And that's really what built the path for the next 3 years. We got that, we won that grant, and for the next 3 years, we were building really the Springfield, Massachusetts digital twin, if you will. Just to give you an idea on Springfield, it's roughly 86 square kilometers, so it's not really huge. Just to give you an apples to apples comparison, it's really almost similar to where the island I'm on right now. I'm in Abu Dhabi Island, just that island. That's roughly 100 square kilometers. In comparison, Dubai City is 4,100 square kilometers. So it's 1/50th of the size of Dubai. And the outcome of that sort of, we took that city and we said, okay, with the introduction of AVs, what are we looking at in terms of street reduction? And how can we convert that using nature-based solutions to a linear urban forest? And that's, by the way, the name of our entire project is going to be the linear urban forests. And the outcome was actually we can sequester on an annual basis. We can add 14.4 million trees. We can sequester annually over 10 tons of CO2 just using that. We're just redefining with the induction of AVs. We're redefining how the city should respond, because the problem is capitalists will seize on the extra space. And that's the sad reality. Capitalists will want to build more retail, will probably want to build more commercial spaces, more spaces that generate capital and revenue.
For those who are not familiar with the project, can you elaborate on what it would look like exactly?
Actually, if you go on urbanafforestation.com, there is a good overview of what the project is all about. It starts from the very principle that says, look, with autonomous mobility, streetscape is going to change. It's going to be more efficient. You're going to save a lot of space because of them, because machines are much more accurate in driving. They're less prone to error. And you will not need that many lanes in a road to accommodate for 50 vehicles, because 50 vehicles it's what's called an AVC, an autonomous vehicular cloud. They talk to each other and they're instant. So you're not going to be accommodating for much error. So with that, you save a lot of space. What are we going to do with that space? Well, here's a $1 million idea. The best carbon sequester on Earth today is not a DAC machine, a direct air capture machine, which basically is a machine that captures air and sucks out the carbon and pumps it deep into the ground. That's what the oil companies do today. Actually, the best carbon sequester are trees, and young trees. So we teamed up with the U.S. Forest Services. We teamed up with our partner A Forest, who actually are the disciples of the Miyawaki method inventor. So they came up and they said, okay, this is the mix of trees that will sequester the most amount of carbon for you. And we said, okay, we take that mix and we spread that in the new safe space. And that's really that's in a high level. That's basically what the project is. The rest is just details and technical know-how of finding out the value, building basically geospatial models and understanding that on a block level, what that means. Because policymakers, and I can tell you that from being on the council for some time, policymakers understand things in nominal terms, in nominal dollar terms, but they also understand what it means for their districts. And I think that's where we had to really do a little bit of work to be able to communicate this. Because for a planner, it's a no-brainer. Oh, that makes sense. Yes, you should do that. But for a policymaker, they don't know how to sell that. What am I getting for that? There are health benefits. How can I quantify that? So we teamed up with health experts. There are, climate folks that we had to team up with to understand the value of carbon. Because people buy carbon today and they spend good money on it to, really, these are what's called the carbon credits. So, in a nutshell, that's what the project is. But if you look at that website, there is also fully sort of a geospatial model tab that shows you the kind of outcome of what that entire effort looked like. And it's based on, broken down by what's called a census tract. It's what's really used to allocate budgets on a city level, and understand how much expenditure needs to go where. That's the way we can actually sell this project, especially since it started as a research initiative and it's ending up as a practical application. The outcome of that research is now we're piloting it in a city block in Springfield. So it actually, I think that was one of the proud moments of the past 5 years of my career.
Very cool. Congrats. Okay, so you use the space you save, or that we save in the future, of the lanes, because we have automated cars, and you use that space to plant a forest, let's say. And it's an interesting topic that you brought up. How do you balance economic returns with sustainability goals in your planning projects?
It's a very tricky subject, right? And you always have to establish the baseline, right? So I'll just put on my mayor's hat for a sec. And if you are to sell to me that project of the linear urban forest, well, I know how much my city is generating in terms of revenue. I know what the economic performance is. What are you going to provide for me? Because that, for me, there is no business justification of just planting trees. I need a tangible outcome. And if that means you give me additional sort of dollar value of benefit to me, then I'm on board. I'll be able to lobby my constituents to follow through with this idea. So it was a very tricky one, because our agenda was actually how do we mitigate the carbon footprints of cities, because we have a climate emergency that we have to think about. And there is the opposing force of the sort of the capitalist nature, right? The cities have to continue to perform economically well. And that's sort of the tug of war we have to deal with. It's not really an easy answer to say how we have dealt with it. It's a lot of kneading the dough. There's a lot of kneading and a lot of tweaking the model. So there is, on the back end, there is a supervised machine learning model, which is basically an infinite number of scenarios with an infinite number of street configurations. And there's actually they're not infinite; they're 400 in our case. But from the most conservative to the most progressive, and we had to find out where's the sweet spot, because we know what can be sold and what can't be sold, because we know what the mayor's objectives are. So that's where we had to be a little bit careful, and we had to all use some collective intelligence there.
What solution do you see on how to measure sustainability in our economical terms for the future?
So actually, we have approached this from several angles. I'll give you one example of what we did. Thinking about, let's say, public health, right? That's a good area to focus on. So in terms of public health, just by improving the air quality and reducing the urban heat island effect, what you're doing is you're improving the mental welfare based on research, and we actually rely on empirical research. And we say that's expected to reduce your emergency cases by 15%. What that means is you're reducing your stress on your public hospitals by, let's say, I don't know, 8 hours. I forgot what the number was, but reducing your annual costs, your annual OPEX by $10 million, right? So that's how we actually approach this. So we actually start from a high level conceptually, but really all the way, what that means for your bottom line, what that means for you as a city, what does that mean for you in terms of maintaining your road infrastructure? What that means for you from stormwater management systems perspective, because it's much like in Chicago when the storm is there. You know what happens in Chicago, for example, the river floods, and the river water mixes with the sewage system. So imagine the repercussions of that. So if you build a nature-based solution that would mitigate this, what's the dollar benefit of that? And then you'd have to think, oh, well, you'd not have to clean the river water as frequently as you do as per status quo. So we did think about it from sort of stormwater management perspective, from healthcare perspective. We thought about it from traffic accidents perspective. And I think there was the 7 different areas that has been explored for this to really build a case where there is a lot of benefit, tangible dollar term bottom line that you have to think about.
You said you've studied the population distribution. What are like the most interesting or surprising outcomes you found there?
Population distribution is very interesting, in this side of the world, but it's not very dissimilar from my hometown in DC, where I lived for 8 years. So I'll just give you the example of Noma in DC. DC is a very small town, not very different in terms of size from Springfield. There, I lived in an area that was called Noma it was northeastern, just north of the Union Station, if you know where the Union Station is in DC, right? It's just north of it. That area historically was actually the specific demographic lived there, really the old timers of DC, African Americans, Hispanics majority. And then over time, you will see how so because of private developers, they came into the scene, and they started developing their sort of premium residential complexes. And I went to MIT and I went back to DC in over a 1-year period, and I noticed that all of the people that I'm used to seeing are gone, and they're replaced by white collar folks primarily. And what happened was, this is what we call gentrification, right? You push out by indirect means, by raising the price values, you push out certain populations out of certain areas. That example is very common in almost every part of the world. And this is what I try to focus on specifically at what I do here, is how to connect people who are disparate otherwise, using public transit means with their right to the city, right? If we think about the right to the city, Jane Jacobs and all the great thinkers, the urbanists that we have learned in our career, how do we bring the bottom quintile to have the full access to all the resources of the city that is their right to begin with? And what I have noticed initially is that people congregate based on several things. 1 is income, 2 is resources, and 3, unfortunately, design. There are some design components that directly or indirectly cause people to live in a certain place in a certain way. And I think giving them the power of access will break that apart. And that's basically one of our main objectives here, is to actually provide full access for folks around this otherwise disparate population.
And how do your urban planning and design projects intersect with supporting these economically disadvantaged bottom quintile of the population? Can you provide some examples of projects that have successfully uplifted these communities?
Yeah. Totally. I'll give you an example of the senior citizens research we've done at the DC Council. It was really a planning exercise. The first thing we had to do is identify spatially where the senior citizens, and not only the senior citizens, right? Because we think about the minority. That's sort of the no-brainer for a planner. But thinking about the minority, and that minority is really the tough question to ask. And in the case of the senior citizens, for example, we think about where are the underprivileged senior citizens residing in the district. And I think they were residing in the northeast and northwest of the district. But then the next question is we identified the bottom quintile. Who of those bottom quintile have difficult? Where is that minority in the minority we identified? And how can we help them? Because often those are the ones that are completely left out. The colorblind ones, right? The hearing impaired ones, the ones who have different kind of special need requirements. How can we accommodate for those from a budget perspective, from a planning perspective, from an investment perspective? For example, for the hearing impaired, how can we develop around their neighborhood all the sort of ADA requirements that also accommodate for the hearing impaired individuals, so they can actually walk around their neighborhood safely, get into their community amenities, get into their supermarkets, go to the hospital if they want to, or the clinic, without having to rely on anybody. So that the only way to think about that is to identify A, the minority, and B, the minority in that minority. And there are several minorities. It's not just one minority. So there are minorities physically, there are minorities ethnically, there are minorities from sort of from an income perspective. So we have to think about all those facets to be able to help them in a true sort of just way.
If you're enjoying the show, I have a small favor to ask that would mean the world to me. By rating and sharing the podcast, you're helping us grow and spreading our mission of making sustainability really desirable and cool to a wider audience. Besides of that, imagine impressing your colleagues with the latest insights on sustainable architecture. So make sure you follow the podcast and become the most informed in the room. Thank you so much for your support. It's so crazy how many thoughts go into urban planning, and people live in cities every day and don't think about these facts. And for example, in the Chicago Riverwalk East project, that also focuses on socioeconomic accessibility through the design. Can you discuss some of the thinking behind the project and how it uses design to promote accessibility and equity?
Oh yeah, let me give you a little bit of a story on that project. So that happened in my in-between break when I was at MIT with a great team at a great firm called Site Design Group. What happened there is I went there for a sort of a summer mission and my main remit was, let's come up with a concept and schematics design for the Riverwalk East. And I had just come out of designs. I had just come out of sort of planning theory. And actually I was struggling with how do you tie planning theory with the built environment? How do you take the street ballet and tie it with some data science methods and then create a product out of it? So I remember at that time in Chicago, there was a big hit of two things. One is Pokemon Go, and two was Snapchat. People were going crazy with Snapchat at the time. So we actually used those tools to identify where people like to go informally. And then we created a street ballet, an experience, a journey of experiences along the Riverwalk that would foster to that. And it was an interesting time because I think at the time, Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, was running for re-election. And there was the other facet which was this is a public-private partnership project. So there were four main vendors, and it was a 10-year sort of negotiation that was being had. So it was a very tricky situation. So you're doing all of this cool designer stuff where you think as a designer you can solve all world's problems. Spoiler alert, not true. But then there is also the realistic side where people have businesses and they have needs and you have to accommodate for them. So there were these multiple hats the folks at Site and myself were trying to put to settle that project. I would say it was probably one of the most exciting US-based projects I have worked on, just because it was a public project. The main currency there was actually making sure that it's a public arena. People like to walk there, and people like to go and sit there, and they're like little pockets, little love pockets, lover's nest, and all these great sort of landscaping tools. I remember that was something I learned from Hana Ishikawa. But all these things are manifested in the Riverwalk East. I would say there was the sort of data science bit was an input rather than an output of that.
What was like the biggest challenge of the project?
Well, at the time, the design part and sort of translational theory was easy for me because I've been doing design for the better of almost a decade. The difficult part was really then seeing the negotiations happen with the private partners, because they had different priorities. They're business owners, and making sure, and there was the city as well. So the city of Chicago it was actually a three-way street. There was the designer side, the consultant side. There was the sort of our private partner, or the people who want to open up businesses there. And there was the city. So my job is to make sure that the design accommodates to all the needs of everybody. That includes cost, that includes design, that includes sort of um, delivery and timeliness of the project. So that I would say that bit of the whole design process of sort of concept and schematic were an easy peasy. DD was an easy peasy, I would imagine, in respect of actually getting the buy-in of the client.
What priority does a private investor have in such a project?
Well, there is the feasibility bit. I would imagine we have to ensure that I think it was a 10-year contract, so there was a 10-year sort of investment of covering their rent, whether it's through an upfront cost or through a running cost. So that was one priority. So how much does it cost me to run that facility? Second is, what's that going to do to the access to for example, I own a restaurant, or I own First Lady's boats. I think that was just opposite from the Apple store. What does that mean from my footfall? How many people are going to pass by my facility? Right? If you're going to put my facility in a location that's a little bit hidden, that's going to impact my footfall. And what that's going to do, that's going to impact my business. So you're going to get a lot of sort of conversations, and you're going to get a lot of pushback. So we had to actually tread carefully there, because their success, the success of the private partner, is the success of the designer and the city. Because what that would mean is, from a designer side, is the design goes ahead. From a city side, is increased taxes because the private partner gets increased sales. So it's everybody wins situation. We just have to figure out where that is.
And you're the one that has to bring everything together.
It's always a team effort. I don't think it's a one man show. But definitely the designer has to be aware of all of these sort of stressors in a project delivery of this nature.
So can you walk me like through the experience? You mentioned what was it called? Pokemon, the game?
Pokemon Go. Yeah.
Yeah, Pokemon Go. So I'm imagining like a lot of fun interactions throughout the park. Or can you walk me through the experience?
I'll walk you through. So we use that as an input to see where people like to congregate, right? And I'll give you an interesting example. I lived on North Sheridan Road at the time, which is just by the lake. And there were areas that I used to go out and see a bunch of people. I'm talking like roughly 50 to 100 people hanging out in, and it's in the middle of nowhere on the beach. And I thought an event was happening. So I go up there and I ask what's going on. And everybody's saying they found a very rare Pokemon. And I was new to Pokemon Go. I wasn't aware of what Pokemon Go was. And that was very interesting for me, because what I was seeing as a planner is a completely dead place back in 2013 when I was in Chicago. I was looking at that. That was a completely dead place. And now it's completely busy for virtually no reason other than a video game on their cell phones. So that for me was very fascinating, and it actually made me re-question all of the 5 pillars of the city, Kevin Lynch, right? The node, the street, the district, etc. All of that, because of the digital introduction to our lives, has become less static. It's more of a dynamic thing. A node could be an empty beach. Next, it could be a plaza. Next, it could be the red district. We don't know, because technology now is this very, very dynamic layer that changes our perception of space. So that was very interesting. And basically, I tried to use that to understand where people are congregating on the Riverwalk, on a less concrete way. Do people are willing are they willing to be inconvenienced to go to certain parts of the Riverwalk that are a little bit uncomfortable? Then if they do, how can we make that a little bit more of a comfort place, of a more appealing place to exist in? Secondly, where do people actively like to go and take photos on social media tools, which was, I remember at the time it was Snapchat. There were specific areas where people really like to go out to, and I was curious to see what was the reason for that. And lo and behold, it was probably they wanted to capture the sunset, or they wanted to capture things that we don't really think about. They wanted to capture a certain angle of where the sun is at that time of the day, or the fountain that's probably 100 feet away, 300 feet away. There was a fountain in the distance, and they wanted to make sure they capture it in their photo. That was really the input that fed into the design. So we come to that and we start to embrace it.
It's interesting what you said. It's really mind blowing. Like, how does urban theory change with digitalization?
It is, and you know, Latina, the thing that I struggle with most is there is a I don't know if you know Liam Young, Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, very close name to your podcast. Um, he said, and when we were in this Sensible City seminar with Carlo Ratti, we used to always debate about how technology is progressing so fast, but our culture doesn't keep up with it. And Liam Young said something that resonated with me throughout the years, which goes along the lines of ideology does not grow at the same pace as technology. Right? We can build all these amazing technological tools. For example, we can build cars that accommodate for ride sharing in this part of the world where I'm at, but people still like to ride their car solo. They like their privacy for, cultural reasons. And that shift in culture does not happen in a year or two. It takes generations to happen. And really that's the part that is very interesting to me at this point in time is how can you actually synergize the two? How can cultural advancement keep up with the technological advancement so we all progress as a society? Because the clock is ticking, and as a recent father, I am really concerned of leaving Earth a little bit more habitable than when I came to it for my son as he grows up. And we just had a crazy 100-year storm here, and costing the country over 3 billion dirhams, which is about $800 million of just infrastructure costs. So you can imagine what that means if this is going to happen more often. These are the things that I'm really concerned about in this part of my career and my kind of life at that point in time.
I always thought that architecture and urbanism was like really slowly progressing because it's just as it is. But maybe it's what people want it to be, Maybe
Exactly.
we're not ready. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, ultimately behind the building, there is a client. And usually the client is a group of people or a person in some parts of the world. And all the decisions of that person or people, that group of people, do not want a solar panel in their building because it costs them a little bit more to clean it up. And they don't want to incur that charge. They're going to go with old school sort of, core and shell building design. For example, these are the stressors that are less in the control of the designer. So that's where I say the designers don't have all the answers. They like to think they do, and that's what they teach. What they teach designers in design studios and critiques is how to find all the answers.
That's right. You mentioned the big storm that happened, and that brings me back to the topic why we're here: sustainability. What role does sustainability play in your current projects at Etihad Rail, for example?
Well, there are huge country level. I'm not even going to talk about it either. There are country level ESG mandates for 2030, which focus on the sustainability goals of the country. This is especially following COP28. There are really goals and targets for the country to achieve in terms of carbon sequestration, carbon credits, in terms of for corporations, what that means for their carbon footprints. For example, using sustainable recyclable tools inside the office, relying less on artificial light and more on natural daylight. Things that are a little bit more known in the West are actually pacing really fast here because our objectives are mandated from its top down. And I think that's the power of top down governance, right? You see results really quickly. And it's really great because this is the flip side of the coin. It's really great because bottom up approaches tend to be a little messy and slow. Top down, when in the right direction, the results are really astounding.
Aren't they slower, the top down?
I would argue on the contrary. For example, if you get a government mandate that you would have to reduce your carbon footprint by 50% as an entity, you have to abide or you will have to incur some sort of a fine, etc. And so organizations will do whatever they can to meet those objectives. And actually, they try to exceed them. Many of them do. And a bottom up, much like the United States, in the firm I worked at, for example, we do our own due diligence, but we cannot guarantee every other company is doing their own due diligence, right? So it's great in the sense that we know what we're doing is right, but nobody else is being held accountable. We're assuming that everybody is working in good faith as well. But there's very little bit checks and balances to ensure that everybody else works in good faith.
Yeah, the kind of the responsibility of startups to educate people, and if it comes top down, you don't need to do that step.
It's the flip side when it comes to other things. But when things that are actually urgent in nature, such as climate change, where outcome is needed urgently, I think having a really sharp direction where everybody ought to follow, because it's based on empirical evidence and data that is less up for debate, I think that could be very powerful.
So working for the Etihad Rail, I suppose you have a lot of responsibility or a lot in your hands to steer towards those goals, those country goals, let's say. How do you make sure in your designs you move towards there?
Well, planning in nature is sustainable. If the planner is cognizant of all the forces of city planning will come as a sustainable strategy to implement something. And I'll give you an example. When you're thinking about placing a metro station somewhere, as a planner, you have to think about an area that captures the majority of people. Because the alternative is they will rely to the status quo, the conventional means of mobility. So once you take people out of, let's say, an area that has 100,000 folks that are accessible to the station, vis-a-vis an area where there are only 5,000 people, you have increased your sustainability objective by 20-fold by using the initial approach. And that's what planners, what we currently do at work, is we actually think about what is the most sustainable approach that captures that achieves these goals to the maximum capacity with the given constraints that we have.
You said when done right, building in nature is sustainable. What are the biggest mistakes that have been done or consequences that have happened that nobody thought of before that we're learning from now?
I think it's a case by case, Ladina. It depends on the geography. I can tell you what I'm learning in the MENA in general is that in the case of land use, it's less static. It's very dynamic. It's more like you identify the best use, and we will ensure there's that appetite to actually improve. There is regard to due diligence, but also there is regard to the social benefit, and that's where it's interesting actually for me. It's quite a departure from the way the conventional planning I learned, sort of the North American planning practice, where you'd have to follow a certain due process. That for me was very telling in terms of how things are adaptive and agile. And actually, I've come to appreciate it a little bit more. For example, if we are playing, so we're not only, Etihad Rail is a big network, it's freight and passenger. So if you're thinking about freight, right, and you're thinking about the facility you're planning there, if adjacent to that facility there are currently land uses designated for things that don't make sense, if as a railway company we can prove from a planning perspective or from a ridership perspective that this area would not benefit from this, there is a huge attitude to collaborate and redefine the whole area. And I think that level of and it's immediate in terms of the time urgency and comparison is very quick and dynamic. And I think that's very, very important to the success or the failure of a mobility project of this nature.
Reflecting on your experience, what has been the biggest lesson you've learned in your career?
I keep reminding myself of the Kruger-Dunning effect, which is, when people know little about something, they think they know it all. And I try to remind myself of that. So the biggest lesson is one never knows enough about something. And I try to remind myself to stay humble in that regard and continue learning on the subject of really any subject matter, planning included. I've been practicing planning since 2009, and I still think that there is a lot more to be learned. Just because we as a society evolve and our needs evolve and how we view the world evolves. And that feeds back into, for example, the profession of planning. And I think it's very important to be aware of from Michael Sandel's meritocracy hubris, that we might achieve some successes in life does not mean that there is no component of luck. There is always a component of luck to remind us, at least reminds me that I have been a little more privileged than others for reasons that are beyond my control.
Ali, can you debunk one sustainable myth out there? Something that people think is sustainable or is not sustainable that actually is?
I'll give you two. The first one right off the bat is people think that recycling, this is the sort of the cliche. People think that they're recycling, they're contributing to actually environmentalism by just recycling. Actually, only 7 to 9% of all recycled materials gets actually recycled. And there are many reasons for that. One example is if you have a plastic cup and you want to recycle it, to actually effectively recycle it, you have to clean it up and throw it in the plastic bin, where all the other batches are also as clean and of the same type of plastic. One plastic that is contaminated will mean the entire batch gets ruined. This is why people really struggle with the act of recycling. And really, it has created this, when you go to a market, people try to buy, it created the inverse effect because of marketing. People keep marketing the sustainable products, and and consumers are buying double the amount of products now, where it's supposed to be all about modesty. The second one, and this is the one that actually I am interested in, is electric vehicles are not sustainable. The myth is everybody thinks that because they bought their battery powered car that they are being sustainable. They're actually absolutely not, for two reasons. One, and this is based on Toyota's research. This is one of the reasons that Toyota has not gone into the electric route. They have gone into the hybrid route. This is called their 1-6-90 principle. The production of one fully electric car is equivalent to the production of 6 plug-in hybrid cars or 90 hybrid cars in terms of resources and carbon footprint over the life cycle of the car. So you can make one Tesla-like car or 90 hybrid cars. The impact is the same. So that's one. Two, a battery cell car that gets charged will still use fossil fuels as an input of energy, because it's going back to the grid. 90% of the world relies on fossil fuel energy generators. Some solar farms are here and there, with maybe the exception of Palm Springs in California and some others. The majority of power generated is from fossil fuels.
But I guess it's different if you have like your little house with solar on the roof, then it might make more sense than if you charge your car in your multi-story building garage.
Yeah. So let me give you an example in the United States, right? The United States has a modal shift of 5% in 2022. So the fleet on the roads does not exceed, I think it's roughly about 1 million electric cars. I'm assuming that doubled by now. So let's say there are 3 million electric cars on the road. Um, that means 3 million households would need to have solar panels in a primarily fossil fuel dominated continent. Well, the United States is almost a continent. Um, I That's a little bit difficult. It's probably more practical in smaller areas in Scandinavia. I would imagine Norway is a good example. The challenge with Norway is they don't get enough insolation. They don't get enough direct sunlight to justify the business case of a solar panel. So you see, there are these pull and pulls that make it very tricky to get clean energy. So, step one, I mean, I understand why, for example, Tesla promotes electric mobility because it's sustainable. Because if you centralize all the energy sources to be from one source, so all of my problems are with that fossil fuel generator, then I have only one problem to solve. I don't have 250 problems to solve. But that doesn't mean the problem is solved by resorting to electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have the same carbon footprint, if not more.
Yeah, but I understand what you say. It's like, again, we're back at that long-term thinking that takes a lot of time in humans. So he's educating people on switching to electrical cars, even though right now it might not make fully sense, but so that the problem he's going to solve, or we're going to try to solve in 20 years or 10 years or hopefully 5 years, then the mentality shift has already happened. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. That probably is an optimistic way to view it, and I would hope that would be the case. I'll give you an alternative scenario, which actually we do have it in practice. We do have it around here. Hydrogen cars are great. The only problem with
Why?
hydrogen cars rely on water. Their byproduct is water. H2O. It's a compressed tank that generates energy. The only problem is we have not invested enough research to develop a safe vestibule for hydrogen, safe enough to end up to be produced on mass scale for the consumers. But that challenge was the same for electric cars, for battery cars. If you remember back in 2008, people were thinking battery cars are a ridiculous idea. And think about the infrastructure that is associated with it today. For example, if people need to travel from, I'll talk about Chicago, or I can talk about the UAE, from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah, which is a northern part of the country. There are no charging stations along the way. You can't get an electric car to do that. Your only way is if you build a buffer of 150 miles around your house, and that's a two-way trip. So you go 150 miles and 150 miles back so that you can charge at home. So it really limits your mobility. And you probably know, Ladina, people do not like to be limited because mobility is freedom. Um, in the case of hydrogen, all you have to do is replace the petroleum tank with a hydrogen tank. Keep the existing infrastructure as is.
Very interesting. So where do you see the future go with mobility?
I do think that autonomous vehicles are bound to happen. I think it's just a matter of time. I mean, the problem it's the trolley problem, right? With autonomous vehicles, we hold machines to account, although they have a much lower chance of error than humans. So, if an autonomous vehicle hits a biker like it did in the United States on several occasions, we bash the entire autonomous mobility industry. While people have accidents 20-fold more than the autonomous vehicles do. But we do put them under the microscope because no one else pays it. The car does not pay the price. What are we going to do? Set it up on fire? That's not enough. So that's the issue. It's a dilemma, actually. But I do see that the future is going to be autonomous to some degree. I do see it's going to be shared. I do see that the future is going to be modest. So it's not going to be extreme, fully autonomous. People still are going to like to have their backyards or their garages with their cars that they want to drive themselves. So I do think there's going to be that modesty in between where there's a progressive front and there's a conservative front, much like how we have our politics today.
Ali, I'm really looking forward to seeing more of what you find to break and make this world a better place. It has been super inspiring talking to you. If people want to follow more of your work, where can they find you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on my website, which is just off of my LinkedIn. I can be approached by my email, alij@alum.mit.edu, or just holler on LinkedIn. Happy to connect to anybody. I would have to say that I appreciate the opportunity, Dina. Thank you for the time. This has been a great experience.
Thank you very much. Really looking forward to keeping in touch with you.
That's great. Looking forward to it.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials @LadinaShipf. Thanks.